This will be our last video for Chapter 13. We'll finish up with descriptive research strategies, specifically speaking about case studies. Just to remind ourselves, we've already talked about observational studies, content analysis and archival data, and surveys. If you haven't watched any of these videos, please go back and try to find them in the module. We're going to finish up now with case studies. So the case study design is really an in-depth study of a single individual or a very small group. Now, this in-depth study is a very detailed description, again, of a single individual typically, or a very small group of individuals. It might involve an intervention or a treatment that's administered by a researcher. Now, I'm going to read you a description, a shortened version of a case study involving a young boy with autism. So Simon was a 7-year-old boy with severe autism and profound learning difficulties. He was mute and doubly incontinent. He had extremely limited repertoire behaviors, mostly consisting of tapping and twirling, but he also enjoyed peering through lines and twiddling sparkling and brightly colored objects. He relied on routines and would scream uncontrollably for hours if his routines were disturbed in any way, or he was presented with new situations. Simon had proved impossible for his mother to wean, and he had never eaten solid food. His mother had made several attempts, but he would resist and gag at anything other than liquid, which he had to have from the same bottle with the same nipple, or a new one until it reached the same consistency. He existed on a liquid food supplement, but he was extremely frail, and it was felt that his future health was uncertain. It was a priority to move him on to a solid diet. So that's the first part of the case study, where they explain to you what the problem is. After some false starts, a behavioral method was used. A professional support to the nursery nurse designated to carry out the program. Simon was to retain his liquid supplement in a bottle at the usual times to ensure he had some nutrition and ease parental anxiety, because previous attempts to interfere with his bottle time had led Simon to completely rejecting all food, including the bottle, and he ended up being hospitalized and being drip-fed for several days. At 2 other totally different times of the day, he was taken to a different setting and offered food. To begin with, he just had to tolerate a spoonful of ice cream touching his tongue, for him to be allowed to play with a large box in which all manners of his delights had been placed for 3 minutes. After 3 minutes of play, Simon was returned to the nursery nurse and offered another spoonful. So here, the second part of the case study, explaining what the treatment was going to be. Initial extreme resistance rapidly dissipated, and in 4 months' time, Simon was eating a bowl of ice cream before being allowed to play with his objects. It took a further 3 months for him to tolerate ice cream mixed with custard, then savory smooth soups, then mashed potatoes, then some lumps. It took 2 years of a slow step at a time program for Simon to be eating a reasonably varied diet of solid foods. And then, in the end, it tells you the outcome. So that's just an example of a shortened version of a case study. Now here's another example of a famous case study. I don't know if you would recognize her by her real name, Shirley A. Mason. Does anyone know who this might be? Think about it. Has anyone ever heard of Sybil? Well, Sybil was actually, back when I was in college, I was fascinated with Sybil. I remember I learned about her in one of my classes, and I read the book that was written about her. I watched the movie, and I was actually really sad to find out that she was a fake. She wasn't that case study. It was basically, if you go ahead, I'm going to have you listen to a podcast. When you listen to the podcast, you'll hear the story. So rather than me repeat it all. But basically, the short of it is that a therapist found her case very interesting and suggested that she had these multiple personalities, and she built on it from there. And so the podcast kind of talked as her roommate telling you how this all went about. So it's kind of interesting to see how, sometimes case studies are not what they seem to be. Sometimes instead of a case study, we have a case history, which is a case study without really any treatment or intervention. It's just the history of what happened and the explanation of what happened and follows perhaps a person over the course of time. So probably one of the most famous situations of these would be Henry Molaison, or HM. So I'm going to have you guys watch a separate video on him, but perhaps you learned about him in Psych 101 or in a psychobiology class, and he's famous for having his hippocampus removed and not being able to form any new memories. And basically, his case history has taught us a lot about what we know about memory today. So now just a little bit on strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, because that's one individual, you're not averaging out results over a diverse group, so some specifics might really stand out. It's a very detailed description. It can be very vivid and powerful, convincing, much like Sybil's case. It's very compatible with clinical work, so a lot of times you see therapists that have these case studies that they'll publish. It can study rare and unusual events. Jeannie was a case study. And it can identify exceptions to the rule. The weakness is, of course, limited generalization. You can't take a single individual and generalize what you've learned about them to the population. Definitely potential for selection bias and potential subjective interpretation. So again, that's really what happened with Sybil, was this subjective interpretation. The therapist thought, made this assumption based on some of her symptoms that she had multiple personalities, and went wrong from there.